On July 30th, 1947, a baby boy was born in the Austrian village of Thal. His name was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Nobody in the village could have known it then. How could they? Thal was a quiet place near the city of Graz. People knew their neighbors, families often stayed there for generations. The village sat between forests, farmland, and rolling hills, and most days followed a familiar rhythm. If you had walked through Thal that summer, nothing would have seemed unusual. Children played outside, farmers worked the land. Neighbors stopped to talk in the street. Life was simple, predictable, comfortably familiar. There was no sign that one of the most recognizable people in the world had just entered that story. No sign that this small village boy would one day travel far beyond Austria. For now, he was simply Arnold, a newborn child growing up in a place where very few people expected life to stretch much further than the horizon. And in many ways, that is where the story truly begins. When Arnold was born, Austria was still recovering from the Second World War. Only 2 years had passed since the fighting had ended. That might sound like a long time. For the people living through it, it wasn't. The war was over, but reminders of it were still everywhere. Families were trying to rebuild their lives. Many had lost relatives, others had lost homes, jobs, or any sense of certainty about the future. In villages across Austria, people were focused on practical things, finding work, supporting their families, creating a life that felt stable again. Dreams of fame or international success rarely entered the conversation. Most people were simply trying to move forward, one day at a time. The Schwarzenegger family lived much like many of their neighbors. They were not wealthy, they were not connected to powerful people, and they certainly did not look like a family destined for international fame. If you had visited Thal in the late 1940s, the idea would have sounded almost ridiculous. Why would anyone expect a future movie star to come from a village like this? Hollywood was an ocean away. America felt like another world entirely. For most people, life followed a familiar path. You grew up, you found work, you built a family, and you stayed close to home. That was the future most people understood. Nothing about Arnold's early surroundings suggested that his life would be any different. Yet that is exactly what makes his story so remarkable, because before the movies, before the championships, and long before millions of people knew his name, Arnold Schwarzenegger was simply a young boy growing up in post-war Austria, a boy whose future was still impossible to imagine. And inside the Schwarzenegger household was a man whose own life had been shaped by war, discipline, and duty, a man who would have a powerful influence on Arnold's childhood, his father, Gustav Schwarzenegger. Arnold's father, Gustav Schwarzenegger, worked as a police officer. Before that, he had served in the military during the Second World War. Like many men of his generation, he had lived through years that left a lasting mark. Those experiences shaped the way he viewed the world, and they also shaped the way he raised his family. Gustav believed discipline mattered, not because he enjoyed being strict, because he believed life would eventually test everyone. Inside the Schwarzenegger home, rules were taken seriously. Children were expected to listen, responsibilities were expected to be handled, and respect for authority was considered important. If a task needed doing, Gustav expected it to be done properly. He was not the kind of father who handed out praise freely. What mattered most to him was effort, the belief that a person should keep going, even when something felt difficult. That was the atmosphere Arnold grew up in day after day, year after year. Arnold and his older brother, Meinhard, experienced those expectations every day. They did not appear only when something went wrong. They were simply part of life at home. If there was work to be done, the boys were expected to help. If a task was given, it was expected to be finished properly. That may sound strict. For Gustav, it was simply normal. One thing Arnold would later remember was how rarely his father handed out praise. A good result did not usually lead to a big celebration. More often, it led to a new challenge, a new expectation, or a reminder that there was still room to improve. For a young boy, that could be frustrating at times, especially when the person you wanted approval from was your own father. Yet Gustav genuinely believed he was helping his sons prepare for life. Whether Arnold agreed with that approach or not, he encountered it every single day, from morning until evening. As Arnold grew older, his relationship with his father became more complicated. There was respect between them, but there was pressure too. Gustav had clear ideas about what a young man should become. Arnold did not always fit neatly into that picture. That tension would appear more than once as the years went by. What makes this period interesting is that neither of them could see the future. Gustav was raising his son according to the values he believed in. Hard work, responsibility, discipline. From his perspective, those qualities mattered. Arnold, meanwhile, was beginning to develop interests and ambitions that reached far beyond the world his father knew. The gap was still small, almost invisible, but it was there, and it would continue to grow. Looking back, it is easy to see that Gustav had a powerful influence on Arnold's early life. Whether Arnold appreciated it at the time is another question entirely at home. However, there was someone else shaping his childhood every single day. Someone much closer to his own age. His older brother, Meinhard. Arnold was not the only son growing up in the Schwarzenegger household. He had an older brother named Meinhard. For most of their childhood, the two boys experienced life side by side. They shared the same home, the same parents, and many of the same expectations. If you had visited the family during those years, you probably would have seen the brothers together more often than apart. Yet something interesting happens in almost every family. Two children can grow up under the same roof and still become very different people. That was true for Arnold and Meinhard. The same father, the same rules, the same household. But as the years passed, their personalities began to move in different directions, and those differences would shape much more than either of them could have imagined. As the brothers grew older, the differences between them became easier to notice. People who knew the family often remembered Arnold as the more energetic of the two. He enjoyed being involved, he enjoyed being noticed, and he rarely seemed to run out of energy. Meinhard was generally more reserved, less likely to place himself at the center of attention, more comfortable observing than performing. Neither approach was right or wrong, they were simply different. And that is often how family life works. Two children can experience the same events, listen to the same parents, and sit at the same dinner table, yet develop completely different personalities. Looking back, it is easy to see that Arnold and Meinhard were already beginning to follow their own paths. When two brothers grow up together, comparisons often happen without anyone planning them. Nobody needs to announce a competition, it simply appears. One brother learns something first, the other notices. One performs better at school, the other notices that too. Sometimes the comparison is spoken out loud. Most of the time it isn't. For Arnold and Meinhard, those small moments were simply part of everyday life. The brothers shared the same home, the same parents, and many of the same experiences. Because of that, each became a natural point of reference for the other. Looking back, what stands out is not a single rivalry or dramatic event. It is something much quieter. Arnold was slowly becoming used to measuring himself against the people around him, not in a cruel way, not in an unhealthy way, just in the way many competitive young people naturally do. Without realizing it, he was beginning to enjoy the feeling of improving, of doing something a little better than before. And with each passing year, competition was becoming a more familiar part of his life. As Arnold moved through childhood, competition became a familiar part of life. Most of the time, it did not look important. It appeared in small moments, a game between friends, a race across a field, a challenge that nobody had planned a few minutes earlier. Many children enjoy winning. Arnold seemed to enjoy measuring himself. If something did not go well, he often wanted another attempt, not tomorrow, right away. There was always a sense that the result could be better. Perhaps that attitude came naturally. Perhaps it was influenced by life at home. Most likely, it was a combination of both. Whatever the reason, Arnold rarely seemed satisfied for very long. One challenge usually led to another. As the years passed, something else began to change. The village itself no longer seemed quite as large as it once had. Thal had been Arnold's entire world growing up. The people were familiar, the routines were familiar, even the expectations placed on young people were familiar. Most boys accepted that world without giving it much thought. Why wouldn't they? Everything they needed was already there. Arnold, however, was beginning to wonder what existed beyond it. Not because he had a grand plan, and certainly not because he knew where his life was heading. That would come later. What existed at this stage was curiosity, a feeling that there might be something larger waiting beyond the hills surrounding the village. He could not yet see the path ahead, but for the first time, he was beginning to look for one. By the time Arnold reached his early teenage years, sports had become a regular part of his life. Whenever there was a race, a game, or a challenge, he wanted to be involved. That was hardly surprising. Plenty of boys felt the same way. The interesting part was that Arnold never seemed satisfied for very long. One challenge would end, and before long he was looking for the next one. Something was missing, not because he lacked energy and not because he lacked determination. If anything, he had too much of both. What he lacked was a direction, a goal big enough to capture his imagination. Then one day, something unexpected caught his attention. At first glance, it was only a photograph, but Arnold kept looking at it, and the longer he looked, the more fascinated he became. The man in the photograph was called Reg Park. At that moment, the name meant very little to Arnold. The photograph was another story. He kept looking at it. The man seemed enormous. Not just strong, enormous. For a teenager growing up in a small Austrian village, it hardly looked real. You have to remember, Arnold had never seen anything like this before. Not in Thal, not at school, not anywhere. Then he discovered something unexpected. Reg Park did not spend all of his time in a gym. He appeared in movies too. That caught Arnold's attention immediately. A bodybuilder becoming a movie star, that sounded almost impossible. And yet there he was, staring back from the photograph. Most teenagers discover interesting things all the time, a new hobby, a new sport, a new idea, then a few days pass and their attention moves somewhere else. That did not seem to happen here. The photograph stayed in Arnold's mind. Days later, he was still thinking about it. Who was Reg Park? How had he built a body like that? And how had a bodybuilder ended up in movies? The questions kept returning. That is what made this moment different. Arnold was not simply impressed. He was curious. The kind of curiosity that keeps pulling you back. Again and again. For the first time, he could see a path connecting two worlds that had always seemed completely separate. Physical strength on one side, a larger life on the other. He did not know exactly where that path led, but he wanted to know more. Much more. For most people, a photograph is just a photograph. You look at it for a few seconds, then you move on. That did not seem to happen with Arnold. The image of Reg Park stayed with him. Days passed, yet he kept thinking about it. Who was this man? How had he built a body like that, and how had he gone from bodybuilding to movies? The questions refused to disappear. In fact, they seemed to multiply. Whenever Arnold found a magazine, an article, or even a small piece of information about bodybuilding, he paid attention, not because someone told him to, because he genuinely wanted to know more. The world still felt far away, but it no longer felt unreachable. For the first time, it felt real enough to imagine. Eventually, reading about bodybuilding stopped being enough. Arnold wanted to see this world for himself. At some point during his early teenage years, that curiosity brought him to a local gym. The place was nothing like the famous gyms that would later become part of his life. In fact, most people probably would not have thought much of it. But Arnold wasn't looking for something impressive. He was looking for a place to begin. The moment he walked inside, he found himself surrounded by something he had only seen in photographs. Real people, real training, real effort. Some of the men had been lifting weights for years. Others looked strong in a way Arnold had never seen up close before. For the first time, bodybuilding was no longer a picture in a magazine. It was happening right in front of him, and Arnold could feel himself being pulled deeper into that world. Nobody in that gym looked at Arnold and saw a future champion. How could they? At the time, he was simply another teenager learning something new. There were exercises he did not yet understand, movements that felt awkward, and plenty of experienced lifters who knew far more than he did that never seemed to bother him. In fact, it may have been part of the attraction. Every visit gave him something new to learn, a new exercise, a new piece of advice, or a new goal to work toward. Before long, Arnold found himself thinking about training even when he was not inside the gym. The world that had once existed only in magazines was becoming part of his daily life. One workout led to another, then another. And without making any big announcement about it, Arnold kept coming back, again and again. At first, training was simply something Arnold enjoyed doing. He would go to the gym, learn something new, then come back a few days later, but little by little, something began to change. The gym was no longer just the place he visited, it became part of his routine. A free afternoon no longer meant the same thing it once had. For many teenagers, it was a chance to relax, to spend time with friends, or simply do whatever felt interesting that day. Arnold often found himself thinking about training instead, not because anyone was forcing him. Nobody had to. He genuinely wanted to be there. The more time he spent in the gym, the more familiar it felt, and the more familiar it felt, the more he wanted to return. Without really noticing it, bodybuilding was beginning to occupy a larger place in his life, a much larger place. As Arnold spent more time in the gym, he began noticing small changes. Nothing dramatic, not yet. A little more strength, a little more confidence. Small improvements that most people probably would not have noticed. Arnold noticed them. That was enough. One extra repetition, a little more weight on the bar, a movement that felt easier than it had a few weeks earlier. Those moments mattered to him. They were proof that the effort was doing something. That progress was possible, and once he started seeing those changes, even in small amounts, the gym became harder to stay away from. The work no longer felt like work. It felt rewarding. Every visit seemed to offer another reason to come back. The longer Arnold trained, the more he began noticing something unusual. His enthusiasm did not seem to fade. For many teenagers, a new interest burns brightly for a few weeks. Then something else comes along, a different hobby, a different distraction, a different obsession. That did not seem to happen here. Months after discovering bodybuilding, Arnold was just as interested as he had been at the beginning. If anything, he was becoming more interested. Friends his age often talked about completely different things. That was normal. Arnold enjoyed spending time with them, but part of his attention kept drifting back to the gym, back to training, back to the question that had first appeared when he saw that photograph of Reg Park. How far could he go? Nobody around him seemed to be asking that question. Until recently, Arnold had been moving through life without any clear destination. He enjoyed sports, he enjoyed competition, but those interests had never pointed him toward a specific future. Bodybuilding was different. For the first time, he could look at someone like Reg Park and see an actual path, not an easy path, and certainly not a guaranteed one, but a path nonetheless. That mattered. Many young people have dreams. Far fewer can point to someone and say, I want to do something similar to that. Arnold could. The details were still unclear. He did not know where bodybuilding might lead. He did not know how far he could go, but he had stopped wondering what interested him. Now he was wondering what might be possible. And those are two very different questions. For months, Arnold had been returning to the gym on a regular basis. At first, the changes were difficult to see. That is often how progress works. It happens gradually. Then one day, you look a little closer and realize something is different. That was beginning to happen to Arnold. His body no longer looked quite the same as it had when he first walked into the gym. The changes were still modest. Nobody was talking about championships. Nobody was predicting a famous future. But people were starting to notice. A comment here, a remark there, small observations that would have been impossible a few months earlier. That mattered more than it might seem, because for the first time Arnold could see evidence that all those hours in the gym were leading somewhere. Eventually, training led Arnold somewhere new. The gym was no longer the only place where bodybuilding existed. There were competitions too. For the first time, he found himself surrounded by athletes chasing the exact same goal. That was a very different experience. Inside a gym, it was easy to focus on your own progress. A competition changed the picture completely. Suddenly, Arnold could see where he stood. Not in theory, not in magazines, in real life. Some competitors were bigger, some looked more experienced. Others carried themselves with a confidence that only comes from years in the sport. For a young bodybuilder, it was impossible not to notice, and Arnold noticed everything. The experience answered one question, but it immediately created another. If these athletes could reach this level, how much further could he go? For some athletes, standing beside stronger competitors can be discouraging. It shows exactly how far there is still to go. Arnold seemed to react differently. The experience made him more interested, not less. Seeing bigger bodybuilders did not make him want to step back, it made him want to catch up. And once that idea took hold, it became difficult to ignore. Back in Austria, many people were satisfied when they became good at something. Arnold was beginning to ask a different question. Being good was no longer enough. Arnold wanted to know what the very best athletes were doing, how they trained, how they lived, and how they had reached a level that seemed so far beyond everyone else. The more he learned, the larger the world of bodybuilding appeared. What had started in a small gym was leading him towards something much bigger. There were competitions taking place far beyond Austria, athletes whose names were known across entire countries, champions who had built reputations that stretched far beyond the sport itself. Arnold found himself thinking about that world more and more often, not because he believed he belonged there yet, far from it. At this stage, he still had a great deal to learn. But for the first time, the possibility existed, a bigger stage, a bigger challenge, and a bigger future than he had once imagined. That idea was becoming difficult to ignore. As Arnold learned more about the world of bodybuilding, one country seemed to appear again and again, America. The biggest competitions were there, many of the most famous athletes were there, and some of the opportunities that fascinated him most seemed to lead there as well. For someone growing up in Austria, America could feel very far away. In many ways, it felt like another world. The cities were larger, the crowds were larger, even the dreams seemed larger. Most people around Arnold viewed America from a distance, a place they read about, a place they saw in photographs. Arnold was beginning to look at it differently, not as a distant country, but as a destination. He had no detailed plan, no clear roadmap, only a growing feeling that the future he wanted might exist somewhere beyond the borders of Austria, and for the first time that future felt just real enough to imagine. In 1965, at the age of 18, Arnold Schwarzenegger entered the Austrian army. Like thousands of young Austrian men, he was required to complete military service. There was no way around it. For the next part of his life, the army would become his new reality. The timing was interesting because Arnold was no longer just an ordinary teenager. Over the previous years, bodybuilding had become an increasingly important part of his life. He was training regularly, thinking constantly about improvement, and beginning to imagine a future that looked very different from the one most people expected. Now he found himself stepping into a world of uniforms, schedules, and military discipline. The contrast was impossible to miss. One world was built around orders, the other was built around personal ambition, yet Arnold immediately noticed something unexpected. The army and bodybuilding actually had more in common than most people would assume. Both demanded discipline, both demanded consistency, and both required people to keep going long after the initial excitement had disappeared, the surroundings had changed, but Arnold's goal had not. If anything, it was becoming clearer. For many recruits, military life required a difficult adjustment. Suddenly, every hour of the day seemed to belong to someone else. There were schedules to follow, instructions to obey, and very little room for excuses. Arnold adapted surprisingly well, not because he loved every aspect of military life. There were certainly parts he found frustrating, but the structure itself did not bother him. In some ways, it felt familiar. For years, he had already been building his life around routines. Training sessions happened at specific times. Progress required patience. Results required effort. The army operated in a different world, but many of the same principles appeared again and again. That did not mean Arnold was becoming less interested in bodybuilding, quite the opposite. While other recruits counted the days until military service ended, Arnold continued thinking about the future he wanted to build once it was over. His body was in the barracks, but his ambitions were somewhere much further away. While serving in the Austrian army, Arnold learned about an upcoming bodybuilding competition. For most people, that might not have sounded like a major event. For Arnold, it was different. Competitions were not just about winning. They were opportunities to learn, opportunities to see where he stood, and opportunities to move one step closer to the future he wanted. The timing, however, could hardly have been worse. Arnold was still a soldier. His military responsibilities came first. At least that was how the army saw it. Most recruits would have accepted the situation and moved on. The competition would come and go. Another opportunity might appear later. Arnold did not see it that way. The more he thought about the event, the harder it became to ignore, because opportunities had a habit of disappearing. And Arnold was beginning to believe that some opportunities were too important to miss. Soon he would have a decision to make, and neither option would be comfortable. The competition was getting closer. That was the problem. Every day that passed made the decision harder to ignore. Arnold knew exactly what the army expected him to do. Stay where he was, follow the rules, complete his duties. Simple, at least on paper. For Arnold, it did not feel simple at all. The competition represented something important, a chance to gain experience, a chance to test himself, and opportunities like that did not appear every week. That thought kept returning, again and again. Eventually, Arnold stopped asking himself what the safest choice was. He started asking a different question. What would happen if he missed this opportunity? The answer bothered him more than the risk of getting caught, and that is when the decision was made. Once Arnold arrived at the competition, everything else seemed to disappear. The worries about the army could wait. The risk had already been taken. Now his attention was exactly where he wanted it to be, on the competition, on the athletes around him, and on the challenge ahead. This was the world that had been living in his imagination for years, the world of bodybuilding. Not through photographs, not through magazine articles, right in front of him. The atmosphere felt different from anything he experienced in everyday life. Every person in the room had come for the same reason, to test themselves, to see where they stood. Arnold felt completely at home. The journey had been risky. The decision had been risky. But standing there, surrounded by competitors, he believed he had made the right choice. And before long, something happened that made the risk feel even more worthwhile. Arnold won. Winning the competition felt good. Very good. Arnold had taken a risk. And for a brief moment, that risk seemed completely justified. He had entered the competition, tested himself against other athletes, and come away with a victory. The problem was that the competition eventually ended. Reality was still waiting. Soon Arnold found himself making the journey back to military life, back to the barracks, back to the schedules, back to the rules he had knowingly ignored. The victory had changed nothing about that situation. If anything, it made it more complicated, because Arnold was returning with proof that the trip had been worthwhile, but the army was unlikely to see it that way. As the barracks came back into view, he already knew what was waiting: questions, consequences, and probably trouble. The only thing he did not know was how much. The consequences arrived exactly as Arnold expected. The army was not impressed by his victory. From their perspective, the situation was simple. A soldier had left without permission. Rules had been broken, and punishment followed. Arnold was confined to the barracks for several weeks. It was not a pleasant experience. Then again, he had never expected it to be. The punishment was the price of the decision he had made. What made the situation interesting was Arnold's reaction. He did not return feeling defeated. If anything, the opposite had happened. The competition had shown him something important. He could compete, he could win, and he could hold his own in the world he had been chasing. That realization stayed with him. The punishment would eventually end. The confidence would not. Before entering the army, Arnold hoped bodybuilding might become part of his future. After the competition, he began to believe something much bigger. That bodybuilding could become the foundation of it. By now, Arnold's life looked very different from the one he had known as a child. A few years earlier, most of his world had existed within a small part of Austria that was beginning to change. More competitions were appearing, more opportunities were appearing, and one city was becoming increasingly important: Munich, for someone serious about bodybuilding. Munich offered something difficult to find in smaller towns: people who shared the same interests, people who understood the sport, and people who spent their days thinking about training, competitions, and improvement. That may not sound unusual today. At the time, it was a very different experience for Arnold. Back in Thal, bodybuilding often felt like a personal dream. In Munich, it felt like a real world, a world filled with athletes, coaches, and competitors who were all trying to move forward, and Arnold wanted to be part of it. The longer Arnold spent time in Munich, the more he realized how large the world of bodybuilding actually was. Until then, much of what he knew had come from magazines, competitions, and a handful of athletes he admired. Munich offered something different. It brought that world much closer. In the gyms, conversations rarely stayed focused on everyday life for very long. People talked about training, upcoming competitions, athletes from other countries, and new ideas that were spreading through the sport. Arnold listened carefully, not because he wanted to impress anyone, because he genuinely wanted to learn. Every conversation seemed to reveal something he didn't know yet, a different training method, a different perspective, or a different way of approaching the sport. That experience expanded his thinking. Bodybuilding no longer felt like a personal ambition taking shape inside one young athlete's mind. It felt like a growing community, a community that stretched far beyond Austria, and Arnold was beginning to find his place inside it. Albert Busek had met many young bodybuilders over the years. That was hardly surprising. The sport was full of ambitious athletes hoping to make a name for themselves. Most never became famous. Most never became champions. That may sound harsh. For Albert Busek, it was simply reality. So when a young competitor caught his attention, there was usually a reason. Arnold was beginning to become one of those competitors, not because he was already dominating the sport. He wasn't, not yet. What stood out was the energy he brought into every opportunity, the seriousness, the willingness to learn, and the feeling that he was always looking beyond the next competition. Albert Busek noticed that, and once he noticed it, he continued paying attention. Because every now and then, a young athlete comes along who seems different. Arnold was starting to look like one of them. Having the attention of someone like Albert Busek was valuable, not because success suddenly became easy. It didn't. Arnold still had to train, still had to compete, and still had to prove himself every time he stepped on stage. What changed was something else. The opportunities around him began to grow. That may not sound dramatic. In bodybuilding, it can make a huge difference. The right competition, the right introduction, the right conversation with the right person. Small moments can change the direction of a career. Albert Busek understood that world extremely well. Arnold was beginning to learn it. Little by little, competition by competition, connection by connection, the sport was no longer just about building muscle. There was a larger world operating behind the scenes. Promoters, organizers, judges, people who helped shape careers, and for the first time, Arnold was starting to gain access to that world. The timing could not have been better because his reputation was beginning to grow. For years, Arnold had been the one looking up to other athletes, reading about them, studying them, watching them compete. Now something unusual was beginning to happen. People were starting to recognize him, not everywhere, not yet, but often enough for him to notice. At competitions, his name was becoming more familiar. Athletes who had never met him before sometimes already knew who he was. That was new, and it was a sign that things were changing. The young bodybuilder who once studied photographs in magazines was gradually becoming part of the conversation himself. That may sound like a small thing in competitive sports. It rarely is. Reputations are built slowly, one competition, one performance, one result at a time. Arnold had spent years building his, and people were beginning to pay attention. As Arnold's reputation continued to grow, another change was taking place. The goals that once seemed enormous were beginning to feel smaller, not because they had become less important, because he had already achieved some of them. That changes the way a person thinks. A few years earlier, simply entering competitions had felt exciting. Then came the challenge of winning. Now Arnold found himself looking beyond the next contest, beyond the next trophy, and beyond the next opponent. He wanted to understand how far this journey could go. The more he learned about the sport, the larger the possibilities appeared. There were athletes whose names were known across Europe. Some were known around the world. Those were the competitors who captured Arnold's attention. Not because he envied them, because he wanted to join them. And slowly, almost without realizing it, his thoughts began drifting toward a title that stood above nearly all the others. Mr. Universe. For many people outside the sport, a bodybuilding title is just a name, a trophy, a competition, something that comes and goes. For Arnold, Mr. Universe meant much more than that. The title had a history, and that history mattered. Years earlier, a photograph had introduced him to a man named Reg Park. At the time, Arnold had known almost nothing about bodybuilding. He had simply seen something extraordinary, a physique unlike anything he had ever encountered before. Later, he learned more about the man behind the photograph. And one detail kept appearing. Reg Park was a Mr. Universe champion, not once, several times. That was impossible to ignore, because Reg Park wasn't just another athlete in Arnold's mind. He was proof that a different life was possible. And now, for the first time, Arnold was beginning to believe that the same title might be within reach. For years, Mr. Universe had existed somewhere in the distance, a title attached to famous names, a title found in magazines and photographs, something that belonged to other people. That was beginning to change. The gap no longer felt quite so large. Arnold was competing regularly, his results were improving, and people within the sport were starting to take him seriously. Those developments mattered because dreams feel very different when they begin to look realistic. What had once seemed almost impossible was slowly becoming a legitimate target. Not tomorrow, not next week, but someday. That possibility changed the way Arnold approached the sport. Every competition became more important. Every improvement carried more meaning, and every step forward felt connected to something larger. Mr. Universe was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a destination. Eventually, the opportunity Arnold had been working toward finally arrived. The destination was London. The event was the NABA Mr. Universe competition. For years, Arnold had seen that title in magazines. He had seen photographs of the men who won it. Now he was preparing to stand on the same stage. That realization was difficult to ignore. A few years earlier, he had been a teenager staring at pictures of Reg Park. Now he was traveling to the very competition that had helped make Reg Park famous. The journey itself felt significant, not because Arnold believed victory was guaranteed. Far from it. The athletes gathering in London represented some of the strongest competition he had ever faced. Many had more experience. Many had spent longer in the sport. Arnold knew that. The challenge was real. That was part of what made it exciting. For the first time, he was standing exactly where he had dreamed of standing. Now he had to find out whether he truly belonged there. When the competition finally came to an end, Arnold received the answer he had traveled to London to find. He belonged there. Not only as a competitor, as a winner. At just 20 years old, Arnold Schwarzenegger won the NABA Mr. Universe title. It was an extraordinary achievement. Many of the athletes he had admired as a teenager had spent years trying to reach that level. Arnold had done it before his 21st birthday. For a moment, it is worth remembering how unlikely that journey had seemed. A small village in Austria, a photograph of Reg Park, a teenager with a growing obsession for bodybuilding. And now this Mr. Universe, the title that had once felt impossibly distant, was suddenly his. That victory changed the way people saw Arnold. Promoters noticed. Competitors noticed. People throughout the bodybuilding world began paying attention. But perhaps the biggest change happened inside Arnold himself. For years, he had hoped he could reach the highest levels of the sport. Now he had proof. Winning Mr. Universe answered one question. It immediately created another. What comes next for many athletes? Becoming Mr. Universe would have been the ultimate destination. A moment to celebrate, a moment to enjoy, a moment to admire everything they had already achieved. Arnold did celebrate the victory, but he did not spend very long looking backward. His attention was already moving forward. That may sound unusual for Arnold. It was becoming a habit. Each success seemed to create a larger goal, not a smaller one. The Mr. Universe title had expanded his reputation across Europe. It had also shown him something else. The world of bodybuilding did not end in Europe. The biggest names, the biggest opportunities, and some of the biggest dreams in the sport seemed to lead somewhere else. America for years, America had occupied a special place in Arnold's imagination. Now it no longer felt like a distant fantasy. It felt like the next step, and for the first time Arnold began seriously asking himself a question that would soon change his entire life. What if he left Europe behind? For years, America had existed mostly in Arnold's imagination. It was the place he read about, the place he heard about, the place where so many opportunities seemed to lead. Now he was finally going there. The opportunity came with support from Joe Weider, one of the most influential figures in bodybuilding for Arnold. The journey represented far more than a simple move. Everything familiar was being left behind. Austria was behind him. Germany was behind him. The competitions that had shaped his early career were behind him as well. Ahead of him was something entirely new. A new country, a new culture, and a future that was still impossible to predict. That may sound exciting. It was. It was also a little intimidating. Arnold was still a young man arriving in a country he barely knew, yet none of that seemed large enough to outweigh the opportunity in front of him. For years, America had been a destination. Now it was becoming reality. For years, America had existed mostly in Arnold's imagination. It was the place he read about, the place he heard about, the place where so many opportunities seemed to lead. Now he was finally going there. The opportunity came with support from Joe Weider, one of the most influential figures in bodybuilding for Arnold. The journey represented far more than a simple move. Everything familiar was being left behind. Austria was behind him. Germany was behind him. The competitions that had shaped his early career were behind him as well. Ahead of him was something entirely new. A new country, a new culture, and a future that was still impossible to predict. That may sound exciting. It was. It was also a little intimidating. Arnold was still a young man arriving in a country he barely knew, yet none of that seemed large enough to outweigh the opportunity in front of him. For years, America had been a destination. Now it was becoming reality. The moment Arnold began spending time in California, he noticed the difference. Not one difference. Hundreds of them. The scale alone was surprising. Back in Austria, Arnold had grown up in a small village where most people knew one another. California felt completely different. The cities seemed endless. New neighborhoods appeared in every direction, and everywhere he looked, people were trying to build something. A business, a career, a future. That atmosphere caught Arnold's attention immediately because ambition wasn't hidden. People talked about it openly. That may seem normal today. For Arnold, it felt refreshing in many places. Large dreams attracted skepticism. In California, they often attracted encouragement. Not everything was easy, of course. His English was still improving. Simple conversations sometimes became complicated. Yet even those challenges felt worth accepting, because for the first time, Arnold felt as though he was standing in an environment built around possibility, and he loved it. It was becoming reality. Not long after arriving in America, Arnold found himself spending time around one of the most important people in bodybuilding. Joe Weider. Within the sport, his name carried enormous influence. Athletes knew it. Promoters knew it. Competition organizers knew it. That may sound impressive. The reality was even more impressive. Joe Weider had spent years helping shape modern bodybuilding. He organized events, published magazines, promoted athletes, and helped decide which competitors received the most attention. For a young bodybuilder arriving from Europe, those connections mattered a great deal. What made the situation unusual was that Joe Weider was paying attention to Arnold. Not because Arnold was already the biggest star in bodybuilding. He wasn't. Not yet, but there was something about the young Austrian that stood out, and Joe Weider noticed it. Joe Weider had spent years around bodybuilders, thousands of them. That was one of the reasons people respected his opinion. He knew what talented athletes looked like, and he knew that talent alone was rarely enough. Every year, promising competitors appeared, some achieved success, many disappeared. That may sound surprising. In bodybuilding, it was completely normal. What caught Weider's attention about Arnold was not one single thing. It was the combination. Yes, Arnold had an impressive physique. People noticed that immediately, but they also noticed something else. When Arnold entered a room, he rarely blended into the background. People paid attention to him, sometimes without even realizing it. He was confident. He enjoyed talking to people, and he seemed completely comfortable thinking bigger than those around him. Joe Weider noticed all of that. And the more he watched Arnold, the more convinced he became that he was looking at someone unusual. Not just another bodybuilder, someone with the potential to become much more than that. Having Joe Weider's support did not guarantee success. Arnold still had to earn that himself, but it did change the number of opportunities that suddenly became available, and opportunities were valuable, especially for someone still finding his place in a new country. Joe Weider began helping Arnold establish himself in California, not all at once, little by little, an introduction here, an appearance there, a new opportunity when the right moment arrived. That may not sound dramatic. For a young athlete, it can change everything. Arnold was no longer trying to figure out America entirely on his own. He now had someone who understood the industry, someone who understood the people, and someone who knew how careers were built. The relationship benefited both men. Joe Weider gained an athlete who attracted attention wherever he went. Arnold gained access to a world that had previously been closed to him, and as the months passed, more people began seeing his face, more people began hearing his name. His rise was starting to accelerate very quickly. Eventually, there was one place Arnold wanted to see more than any other: Gold's Gym. By that point, he had already heard the stories every serious bodybuilder had. The gym had developed a reputation that stretched far beyond California, far beyond America. For many athletes, it represented the highest level of the sport, a place where champions trained, a place where future champions hoped to prove themselves. That may sound intimidating. For Arnold, it was exciting. The first time he walked through the doors, he immediately understood why people talked about the gym with so much respect. This wasn't an ordinary training facility. The atmosphere felt different, more serious, more focused. Everywhere he looked, people were working toward the same goal: to become better than they were yesterday. Arnold had spent years imagining places like this. Now he was standing inside one, and he had no intention of leaving anytime soon. The longer Arnold spent time at Gold's Gym, the more remarkable the place seemed, not because of the equipment, not because of the building itself, because of the people. For years, Arnold had studied bodybuilders through photographs and magazine articles. He knew many of their names long before he ever met them. Now things were different. The athletes who once existed only on paper were suddenly standing a few feet away, training beside him, talking beside him, pushing themselves through the same workouts. That experience never lost its impact. Dave Draper trained there, Frank Zane trained there, Ken Waller trained there, and those were only a few of the names passing through the gym. Every day felt like an opportunity to learn something. A new exercise, a new technique, or simply an opportunity to observe how elite athletes approach their craft. That may sound like a dream for a young bodybuilder. For Arnold, it was something even better. It was reality, and every day he spent there convinced him that he was exactly where he needed to be. Among all the athletes Arnold met at Gold's Gym, one man quickly stood out. His name was Franco Columbu. At first glance, Franco did not look particularly intimidating, especially when standing beside larger bodybuilders. He was noticeably shorter than Arnold, shorter than many of the men training around him. That often led people to underestimate him, usually for about 5 minutes, sometimes less. Because once Franco started training, people's opinions changed very quickly. His strength was extraordinary. Stories about it traveled through the gym. Athletes who looked much bigger often discovered that Franco could match them, and sometimes outperform them. That earned respect, a lot of it. Gold's gym was filled with talented bodybuilders. Nobody received admiration automatically. Franco earned his, and Arnold noticed that immediately. There was something about him that stood out. Not just the strength, the attitude, the confidence, the competitiveness, the feeling that he approached every challenge at full speed. Arnold understood that mindset, and before long, the two men began spending more time together. At first, Arnold and Franco were simply two athletes training in the same gym. That changed surprisingly quickly. The more time they spent together, the more similarities they discovered. Both had left Europe behind. Both had arrived in America chasing bigger opportunities, and both were willing to devote enormous amounts of time and energy to their goals. That created an immediate understanding between them. Neither man needed to explain why he trained so hard. The other already understood. That may sound simple. For ambitious people, it can be surprisingly rare. Before long, training sessions became a regular part of their lives. Then came conversations outside the gym, meals together, long discussions about competitions, training in the future. The friendship continued growing. So did the trust at various points. They even lived together, which probably surprised nobody who knew them by then. They seemed to spend as much time together outside the gym as they did inside it. The partnership benefited both men. When one pushed harder, the other usually followed. When one faced a setback, the other understood. And when success finally arrived, they were often standing beside each other. Looking back, Franco Columbu became much more than a training partner. He became one of the most important people in Arnold's life, and one of the few people who truly understood the journey he was trying to make. By the mid-1970s, Arnold Schwarzenegger had achieved something extraordinary. He was Mr. Olympia, not once, several times. Within bodybuilding, he had become one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. People knew his name, they knew his physique, and they knew the success he had built through years of relentless work. From the outside, it looked as though he had reached the top. In many ways, he had. The problem was that Arnold was already thinking about something else, something bigger, Hollywood. That may sound like a natural next step. For Arnold, it was anything but easy. Success in bodybuilding carried very little weight inside the film industry. Movie studios were not searching for the world's best physique. They were searching for actors. And when Arnold began exploring opportunities in Hollywood, the reaction was often disappointing. The same people who admired him on magazine covers suddenly saw problems. Too muscular, too unusual, too different. For the first time in years, Arnold found himself entering a world where nobody cared about his titles, nobody cared about his trophies, and nobody cared that he was Mr. Olympia. Once again, he was the outsider, and once again, he had something to prove. The more people Arnold met in Hollywood, the more often he heard the same concerns. At first, they sounded like helpful advice, suggestions from people who understood the industry. Then he realized something. Most of them were asking him to change who he was. His physique was one of the first issues. Casting directors looked at him and saw a problem. Arnold's body had helped him become the best bodybuilder in the world. In Hollywood, many people believed it would hold him back. He looked too unusual, too muscular, too different from the leading men audiences were used to seeing on screen. The concerns did not end there. His accent attracted just as much attention. Years after arriving in America, his Austrian accent remained strong and unmistakable. Some producers believed audiences would struggle to understand him. Others believed they would never take him seriously. Then there was his name, Schwarzenegger. Many people in Hollywood considered it a marketing disaster, too long, too complicated, too difficult to pronounce. A few even suggested changing it completely. The advice kept coming. Lose the accent, change the name, reduce the muscle, become easier to sell, become easier to understand, become more like everyone else. Arnold listened, but deep down he saw a problem. The more he followed that advice, the less he would look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. One of Arnold's earliest opportunities in Hollywood arrived through a film called Hercules in New York. On paper, the role seemed like a perfect fit. Hercules was powerful, athletic, larger than life. Few people looked more suited to the role than Arnold Schwarzenegger. The reality proved more complicated. The film quickly exposed many of the challenges he would face in Hollywood. His English was still improving, his accent attracted attention, and some people involved in the production worried that audiences would struggle to understand him. That concern led to an unusual decision. Much of Arnold's dialogue was dubbed by another actor. His voice was replaced. As strange as that sounds today, it was not the only thing Hollywood wanted to change. Even his name became a problem. The producers believed Arnold Schwarzenegger was too difficult for audiences, too long, too foreign, too unfamiliar, so they came up with an alternative, Arnold Strong. For a brief moment, that was the name appearing on screen. The decision revealed something important. Hollywood was not looking at Arnold and seeing a future movie star. It was looking at him and searching for ways to make him fit an existing mold. The film came and went. It did little for his career, But Arnold learned something valuable. Breaking into Hollywood was going to be much harder than winning bodybuilding titles. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you enjoyed exploring the remarkable life of Arnold Schwarzenegger. His story is far from over. In part 2, we'll follow Arnold as he continues building his empire beyond bodybuilding in Hollywood into a world even bigger than he imagined. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue creating these stories and sharing them with more people around the world. Until next time, my friend, I'm Leo Belfort. Sleep well.